A lot of my work, presently and recently, I guess has been a study of distance, and within that, these sort of aesthetics of distance in the context of the built environment, and sort of within that, it's heavily involved with the transmission of heritage and tradition. Mm-hmm. So, for example, like a recent show, end of last year at the Marsden Wu Gallery in London, the subject of that show was the English pub. Mm-hmm. And what it aimed to do was to chart the surfaces and textures and forms that are associated with that. And it charted them through time, from the Middle Ages through industrialization to sort of post-industrial times. Mm-hmm. Regarding my research, I've set up a research project with artists called Christopher Roundtree, and we call ourselves the Pubco Research Centre, which is a sort of grand title for the activity of two people. But and our subject of our research is pubcos, which, to explain them quite briefly, is sort of centrally managed chains of British public houses. And we were very much interested in the aesthetics of these places. So as we were friends first and decided found out we had this shared interest in how these spaces were created, how they utilised history. And they took on these forms which came about through a different economic paradigm to the one they were being presented in. So it's pretending to be something else, but it's not, because it's adopted a different economic model. So in the case of the pub, they will take on the sort of Victorian stereotype and expand it into a Walmart, like low cost, high volume retail strategies, so you have the aesthetic of the Victorian pub as a cushioner for the consumer, or something they're very familiar with, something that's ingrained in them, but you have to roll it out in a different market. So it's forms and services. So the English pub evolved from domestic vernacular architecture, which I took from this show to the elements I edited out of what this vernacular architecture looked like, was wall panelling and beams, like structural beams, to hold the building up. And people and communities would gather in these places, and they were like the centre of the community, and just an unself-conscious place to exist and converse and share ideas. And so these forms get associated with this activity just by default, basically. And then moving forward in time, they get reused by people for these associations. So the sort of the next point in the show, beyond the original vernacular use of these pub interiors, was the revival during the 19th century. And it was revived by quite serious architects involved with the arts and crafts movement, and for the sort of, you could say, rather morally worthy values that these forms and services had attached. Yes, but heavily based in, I'd say it's a sort of slightly conservative. And then sort of moving on from these architects, you then had this reproduced by people who are sort of less interested in the sort of worthy notions of this architecture. So we're sort of saying like post-war in Britain. And so going back to what I was sort of talking about distance, it's how these forms, this aesthetic evolves, how it becomes a very conscious deployment of these forms. And it's a very particular feeling that I'm sort of after, and I guess it brings to light how people use their past and how they associate it with it, and how they how sort of time moves essentially. That for me is sort of a phrase that sort of sums up the built world for me. There's a lot of talk about sort of building new worlds and stuff, but the sheer fact that, and it's been like this for millennium, you live in someone else's world, someone else's built world, and you sit around and negotiate all these people's ideas of ornament, ideas of hierarchy, and so it's many people's worlds that you sort of live in, and it's how we sort of negotiate time essentially in the physical world is an old world, and it's, I think what I'm trying to sort of drill down is to what that's like. I guess sort of I came to looking at the sort of the difficulty of things that come from the past and have a long trajectory through different periods and stuff. I associated that with something that might be valid for a sculptural practice. So it's marrying heavy physicality with a complicated history, which these sort of histories, they can have progressive notions about them and quite conservative notions all wrapped up in one. So it's that sort of complicated way that time flows within the built world and communities that I'm sort of interested in, not in essentially making I'm not trying to project into the future, but enough really. So that's why I married the two. I thought it was equating sculpture to that. And why sculpture? Well, that's where my education led me to. I mean, in the context of the show, I guess the 1990s moment of British art that's going to form a big portion of the show. That in my beginnings to become an artist, that was influential in the fact that art suddenly became out there in the wider realm, and I guess it became fashionable, and that was perceived by me as something to do. So all the artists in the show, I consumed along with my contemporaries, and so definitely a direct influence there, and I think the explosion of their techniques and means and materials led on. It gave us, our generation, a palette to work from, a very open palette. And theme-wise, with my practice and young British artists, perhaps there could be a certain sort of Britishness about it, perhaps, negotiating what that might be, and particularly how Britishness is quite loaded in the past and there's inherent sort of conservative nature, and I think this is a subject I've been interested in